Okay, so I'm just going to keep kind of experimenting, I'm putting the darker paint kind of in the center of the petal, and then I'm going to get my water and drag it up. And then get my lighter orange on the edges. So I might even try, my brush is pretty big and I've got this such a small works space with that small flower. So I think I'm going to grab my even smaller brush, the liner brush, looks like just the little pointed tip one, and go back in and do some of the edges. And then drag out the pigment with some water. So make the edges kind of dark and pigmented, saturated, and then bring the lighter value in towards the center. And now I'm just going back in with the darker orange, almost kind of a red. And while it's still wet, I'm going in, so it's kind of blooming and feathering a little bit. And if you think you got too much water, grab a paper towel and just blot a little bit. And I can just blot some of that off and go back in, give it a little bit more control. Okay, so right now we started out wet on dry, and now I'm kind of moving into wet within each petal. So the watercolor is already wet, and then I let the colors bleed together. So it's really nice when you have some areas that look like they're kind of washy with the wet into wet, and then go back in once it's dry and paint some nice dry details so that you have some areas that are nice and crisp line and some areas that are nice and washy, nice and loose. That contrast is really nice. Okay, so notice I've kind of switched back and forth between my two brushes, my filbert and my detail liner. Okay, so I'm switching up my brushes so that I can have areas of fine detail and areas of loose washes. And I think I'm going to give my marigold a little time to rest and dry, and I'm going to go back to it in a couple minutes to put in some nice fine details. So while that's drying, I'm going to do maybe some leaves. I'm going to add some leaves to my marigolds. So I like to sketch them out first. So I'm just going to add some sort of stylized leaves here. And I'm going to make them kind of ornate. I'm going to add some little curlicues on the end. I'm going to make some of them bigger, some of them smaller. Okay, and then I'm just going to play around with my greens. I've got my two different greens, my yellow green and my darker green. And right now I'm painting wet into dry, right? So my page is dry, my paint is wet. So right now I'm not getting too much kind of bleeding, feathering. I'm going to keep the leaves sort of controlled, more controlled than the flower petals. And right now I'm kind of painting a base for my leaves. I'm going to go in a moment with my darker green and give it some fine details. Right now I'm kind of just giving them some little washes to fill them in. Everybody doing okay? Give me a thumbs up. Doing good? All right.
This store
Yes.
and no flower base and plastic.
Yes. So you can change them up. You can make them out of your imagination, or you can use the reference picture and do some marigolds, are the national flower of Mexico. All right, so you can see from my leaves right now I have some gradated washes. All right, so some areas where I used more paint and some areas where I just dragged it out with water to make it lighter. Okay, and then I'm going to go back in with my darker value of green, and I'm going to put in some fine details, some edges, some veins. If you really want these lines to be crisp, then wait until your leaves dry before you do this. I think my marigold's a little bit more dry, so now I'm actually going to go back into my marigold here, and I'm going to add some areas that are more crisp and layer some of the pigment so that there's areas that are really kind of saturated and vivid versus areas that are washy and light. Okay, so you can see that my flowers are kind of a two-step process. I did my light washes and I let them dry, and now I'm going back in to add some dimension with the darker pigment in the middle of the petal and the lighter pigment near the edges. All right, keep going with your flower. I'm going to do a butterfly. And I'm just doing for my butterfly, I'm going to experiment, I think on the bottom wings, I'm just going to do a wet into dry wash. I think I'll try a wet into wet wash for the top wings. All right, notice I'm switching my brushes up. When I get into the smaller fine detail areas, I'm getting my smaller brush out. I'm going to do a little wet into wet for the top. So I'm going to wet my page with clean water for the top wing because I want to do some experimenting. I want to see what this looks like for wet into wet. All right, so I'm letting it bloom a little bit into the wet into wet. All right, that yellow really came out real strong. I'm going to get some paper towel and blot it. right, so I'm just kind of layering my different oranges now. I've laid down my washes and they're drying fairly quickly. Okay, so what I want you to see here is it's kind of a process. Do some washes, let them dry, go back in, do some fine details. Switch up your brushes, take advantage of the ones that are bigger for washes, the ones that are smaller for fine details. Now you could use your liner brush and some black to make fine details, or if you prefer not to have any kind of bleeding, like right now my black is sort of bleeding into the wet areas. If you don't want it to bleed, then you wait until everything is dry and go back in either with your black paint or even with your Sharpie. All right, I think I'm going to let the butterfly rest and do some details later. All right, so you can keep working on your flowers. I was just going to do a little bit of painting on my skull just to demonstrate some shadows. All right, so I've sketched out kind of my basic shape for my skull. And I'm going to show you just a beginning washes to start adding dimension. All right, and by the way, if you look on your watercolor palette, see how the lid has these wells, these little depressions. You can actually use those to make values. So I'm going to use this. I'm going to put some black paint in one and a little bit of black paint in another. And then I'm going to add water to give myself some pre-made values because I want some black to gray, kind of pre-made here. All right, so I'm setting up my little value scale of watercolor paint right here. All right, and the safer thing with watercolor is to paint wet into dry because you have more control. You want to get a little bit more creative with blooms and stuff, then paint wet into wet. And then also, as far as our skulls go, what I'm going to do here is start with a medium value. And by the way, I'm using gray and black. Your skull, you don't have to use gray and black for the shadows. I mean, we saw a student who used like a rusty brown for the shadows. You could use blue for the shadows. I mean, it's up to you. You are not confined to using black and gray. All right, but what I'm doing is first laying down some washes of just a lighter gray value, and later I'm going to darken them up in certain areas that I really want to recede and look like they're going back into space, look empty. All right, don't forget, switch up your brushes. If you're going to do smaller areas, get a smaller brush. I'm going to do the area around the mouth with the smaller brush and the teeth. All right, teeth are going to take me a long time, so I'm going to kind of put those on hold. But I'm doing kind of the jawline and the gum ridges. All right, I'm going to add some little shadows. I'm going to start out light, and later on I'll layer on some more, kind of like some depressions around, shading around the cheeks, cheekbones. Now, this might be a good idea actually when I'm doing the cheekbones here to paint wet into wet and really soften that up with some water. All right, I want some little shadows kind of around the temples and the forehead area. And then later I'm going to go in and add all of my fun flowers and vines and butterflies. So right now I'm just trying to give my skull a little bit of dimension. So I'm doing sort of a realistic skull, and then with my flowers are going to be on top. If you want, you could do more of a stylized Day of the Dead skull where you really just draw from your imagination and do patterns. All right, I want to give it some hollow, I want to give it some areas where the brow line is. So he doesn't have eyebrows, but I'm giving him the areas where the brow bone juts out. Okay, so now I've got sort of my light base done. And now I'm going to go in with my darker black, and I've got my liner brush. And this is very little amount of water. That's why I'm getting this very dark black. No bleeding, no feathering, but I do kind of, I don't want to fill in the nose like flat. So I'm just going to have the edges be dark. Okay, same thing with the eyes. I'm not going to fill them in totally black because I haven't decided. Maybe I'm going to add some flowers like coming out of the eyes. I like that idea. So I'm just making the areas that I want to really look like they're in shadow, really receding. That part's going to be dark black. And I'm really building the pigment. I'm layering it. Started with a wash, layering on more pigment. And if you're paying any attention to me here, I am switching my brushes. I'm using both of these. I'm switching them up quite often. So when I want to extend my pigment, I get my larger brush and kind of just blend it, soften it out. And I use my liner brush for my fine details. All right, I got some water on here now, so I'm just going to kind of let it blend and flow a little bit, get a little bit of washy, unpredictable stuff happening. And I want areas that are really nice and crisp and black and areas that are soft and gray. Nice contrast. Okay, at this point, I would want my skull to dry and then start adding my marigolds and my butterflies. I don't want my marigolds or my butterflies to bleed, so I want everything to be dry. So I'm just repeating my same process that I did for my practice flower, but now I'm putting it onto my skull. All right, and think about if you want to draw first with pencil. I'm using a number 2 pencil, and I'm going to try to draw real soft, and I might even get my eraser and erase some of it before I start painting. So I drew it, but now I'm kind of going over it lightly with my eraser because I don't want those pencil lines to show up in the real thing. Okay, and then by the way, let's say you don't want any of your flower color to bleed onto white areas of your skull. So get your oil pastel and you could make a little barrier. Remember masking? You could mask off a little bit of your skull with the white oil pastel so that you don't get any bleeding of the color into your skull. Okay, but keep in mind you want your page to be dry. Don't do this on wet paint. Okay, so I'll just keep painting my marigold and I can go from here if this was my real painting. All right, keep going on your flowers and butterflies. Keep practicing. Don't forget about caterpillars and spiders. right, there's my little spider dude. All right, so keep filling up your page with all of your experiments and then move on to your real thing.